We're going to be starting a new series on the Epistle to the Philippians. If you're not familiar with Philippians, it's one of St. Paul's 4 letters that he wrote from prison. They're referred to as the prison epistles. And it's personally one of my favorite books in the Bible. Not just because it's short, it's only 4 chapters. So anyone here, if you haven't read a whole book in the Bible before, Philippians is a great place to start. If you're looking really to like for a shorter book, you could go to 3 John. That's like, I think 17 verses for the whole book, all right? But Philippians is a great book. It's got a lot in it. And I think it's going to be a wonderful journey we're going to be going through over the next 4 weeks as we talk about authentic faith and what does it mean for us as Christians to have an authentic faith. We're basically going to, the 4 chapters are just going to be broken down. That's going to be our 4 weeks. Today, Joe's going to be talking to us about a call out of complacency. Next week, I'll be looking at authentic humility. And then authentic love will be week 3. And authentic giving of thanks will be week 4, which will be perfect right as we lead up to Thanksgiving. So we're going to go ahead and get started with our discussion questions. We've got 2 discussion questions. We'll go ahead and get started. Joe will call you back in about 8 minutes, 8 to 10 or 6 to 8 minutes from your discussion and into the large group discussion. So if we could break up, I think, into 3 groups, I think that'll work, all right? Without further ado, y'all go ahead and get started.
We wanted to just cover is what do we mean when we are talking about authentic faith? I mean, you guys had conversations in your groups, and I'm not sure exactly what you were thinking of as authentic, but let's try to come to a consensus about what it might mean. Authentic really means real, genuine, that it's not a copy or a lie or a fake. So when you're in a museum, if you run a museum and someone brings this document to you and says, this is from the 14th century, how will they determine that it's an authentic document? If it's really from the 14th century, from when the people say it is from, that means it's authentic. So experts might do some tests on the paper or analyze the handwriting or something of that nature. What they're looking for is evidence that this document is authentic, evidence that it is what it claims to be or what someone has claimed it to be. So as Christians, if we're to be authentic Christians and lead authentically Christian lives, the evidence has to be there for what we're claiming to be. And so, because when experts examine a document, they see what the qualities and characteristics of that are. They don't just take what someone says is true to determine if it's authentic. They do tests and examine it. So we think that this is an important series because sometimes our desire for God might be really genuine and authentic, but the way that we live out our lives day to day doesn't really always reflect that. And so this is, and when it doesn't reflect that, a lot of the reason is because we are complacent. We'll get into that, but that's why today the theme is a call from complacency. Because just beliefs are very important, obviously, but beliefs aren't enough to make our Christian faith authentic. So St. James says, a famous verse that many know, the faith without works is dead. And even the demons believe that there is one God and tremble. So the demons believe that there's one God, but that's not what makes our faith authentic. Okay, so one of the stories that kind of cemented this for me was I was hearing a woman be interviewed on the radio, and she had just written a book, and she'd grown up Christian, and the interviewer was asking her about her Christian upbringing, what that meant to her, how that shaped her identity. And she responded by saying, it didn't really affect me at all. Basically, all it meant was that I was busy on Sundays. So that's not an authentic Christian life, and we certainly don't want that for our lives. So what we're going to explore today, focusing on the first chapter of, that's the verse from James. What we're going to focus on from the first chapter of Philippians is not being just the kind of Christians who are just busy on Sundays, but how do we make our faith really authentic? And the central truth is that in chapter 1 of Philippians, St. Paul displays attitudes toward life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that will allow us to resist complacency and live more authentic Christian lives. So Don't worry. Life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. We're not going to be talking about American history or the Declaration of Independence. But it just, in looking at the chapter, it kind of seemed to organize itself that way. So we're going to look at those three things: how to resist complacency and live more authentic Christian lives. So, life. Let's start with life. Can someone read this verse for me, please? Can you read it from there? Anyone? Yeah? Go ahead.
Okay. I eagerly expect and hope that I will in no way be ashamed, but will have sufficient courage so that now, as always, Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. If I am to go in on living in the body, this will mean fruitful labor for me. Yet, what shall I choose? I do not know. I am torn between the two. I desire to depart and be with Christ, which is better by far. But it is more necessary for you that I remain in the body.
Okay, thanks. So, as Christians, our attitude towards life, broadly speaking, should be different than others. I think we can all agree on that. And that doesn't mean that we have to be morbid and focused on death, but we are called to a different attitude about death and life than other people in our secular world. So let me ask you a question. In this passage, is St. Paul, does he sound afraid to die? No, right? Not at all. And we shouldn't be either if we're living out our lives of faith in an authentic way and really truly uniting ourselves with Christ. So I think this is a big part of the reason that we get complacent as Christians, because there could be two extremes. One, we could not keep our, we try not to think about death, right? Death is an unpleasant topic, and we usually in our culture, if someone brings it up, it's kind of like, hush, don't talk about that. If you mention death, people don't really want to talk about it. And that's understandable. It can be a tragic and sad event, for sure. But if we don't keep our death in mind, we may not have a sense of urgency, and the lack of urgency can lead to complacency in our faith. And also, a remembrance of death, on the other hand, too much, is that we focus on our life prior to death too much, to an extreme. And to kind of, I'm going to do a demonstration or a little, I guess a demonstration. Some of you may have seen this before, so if you have, bear with me. But this is how we do it. Okay. So, this rope, I'm going to ask you to imagine, I know it will take a lot of imagination, but imagine that it goes on forever in that direction. I know it stops at the door, but just imagine it goes out the door and forever in the other direction. Okay, let's imagine that this is a timeline, so to speak, of your existence. Okay? This yellow part, right here, represents your life in your current earthly body. Okay, like your life that you're in right now. The fleshly body that you're in, your life since birth, and the end of the yellow strip represents our death. Right? So the point of this demonstration is that we focus so much of our time and effort and energy focused on this little section of yellow when we have the whole rope that goes on for eternity. So people right here are like, man, I have to work really hard, I have to get straight A's so I can be successful in this part and then have a good job in this part, right? And we're not thinking, you know, we don't even think about the rest of it. Or, you know, people get mad or upset if their yellow strip is 2 millimeters shorter than others. I mean, there's numerous examples, right? Even in terms of the way that we think about or educate our children. Our hopes for our children are that they'll be really, you know, hopefully they'll get through this part safe without doing anything stupid, and then they'll get here and meet someone, and then they'll be happy for about this much. And, you know, do we truly spend as much time educating them to succeed in the whole length of the rope, or do we spend more time helping them to succeed in this part of the string? So it's just a little visualization that we'll kind of touch back upon. But the point is that as Christians, we think of life not as just this little yellow part. And I think you can see how that would make it for a drastic difference in the way that we think about the whole rope as it is, our whole existence. So, because it's really crazy when you think about it. Even though we're Christians, if we are Christians, and we believe that we have this hope of this entire length of rope, we still live for the yellow part. Pretty much exclusively sometimes. So I would say that's not really being authentic in our faith. Our actions aren't lining up with what we say that we believe to be true. The evidence isn't there in our actions that what we believe and we say to be true is true. And one other important part about this visualization that St. Paul also touches on here in this passage is that we're thinking about our life in terms of a continuity. Okay, so our life, when we die, and when our fleshly bodies fall asleep, we don't necessarily become different people. I mean, we are who we are. Okay, obviously at the resurrection we'll have resurrected bodies and things will be different, but you are an individual. You're not going to become a different person when you die. So in other words, what you do during this yellow part does very much matter, but not for the reason that most people usually kind of assume and operate under during that part. Any questions on that part before we move on? Okay. So we'll move on to liberty, because another reason that we are in need of a wake-up call from our sort of complacent state, sorry, I obviously shouldn't forget to mention this, but the reason that we have the hope of the rest of the length of the rope has to go back to the resurrection. We focus on the resurrection and our hope for eternal life gained for us by Christ. And we'll touch more on that as we go. But let's move on to liberty. Liberty. Can someone please read this section? Maybe someone from the middle? Thank you.
Now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. As a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace, guard, and to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. And because of my chains, most of the brothers and sisters have become confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear.
Thank you. So, in this passage, St. Paul is obviously, as Abuna mentioned, this is one of the letters St. Paul wrote while he was in prison. Literally, he was in chains. His liberty, so to speak, as we think of it, was totally removed from him. But he says, I am in chains for Christ in this passage. And that makes all the difference. Because when we think of it on a larger level, as Christians, some people looking at Christianity think of it as mostly as a set of restrictions, right? Do this and don't do that. But if we're living out our Christian lives in an authentic way, as St. Paul does here, let's really realize that really the Christian life is a life of freedom and liberty, the ultimate freedom and liberty that we can have. And this also goes back, again, to the resurrection. Because we don't have the fear of death, we're not limited by death. Death is the disease, it's the greatest tragedy. And as Christians, we know that we're not limited by this. We don't have to fear death. And I think the fear of death is a big reason why people, they're afraid of that yellow tape running out, because they're afraid of that being over, or what comes after that, so to speak, in certain circumstances. So, yeah, the resurrection is key to understanding how we participate in the ultimate freedom that's gained for us by Christ's resurrection. And it's why we imitate the martyrs, right? We have a very rich history in our church tradition about martyrs. And the Synaxarium is filled with stories of people who were so free from the desires of this life. And a couple of groups talked about the desires of this life, the distractions that hold us back. But the martyrs said, none of that is distracting me. I'm focused on Christ. I am not just in chains for Christ, but I will actually give my life for Christ completely. So really, this is the ultimate freedom. When we are able to reject those things, those distractions that tie us down, this is the ultimate freedom that we can have. Because if we're not able to put off our addictions and our sins, we're still in bondage to them. Even in the prayer of absolution that Abuna prays during the liturgy, it says, Jesus Christ who broke every bond of their sin. So the sin is what bonds us. Sin is what ties us and puts us in chains. But we can choose to be in chains for Christ instead. And that's true liberty. And when we're thinking of that, and we have that in mind, and that's our goal, that's when we can live an authentic Christian life, like St. Paul is living out his authentic faith in chapter 1 here of Philippians. So, and just to sum that up, there's also another part of the liturgy after we read the Catholic epistle that says, do not love the world nor the things which are in the world. The world will pass away and all its desires, but he who does the will of God abides forever. So we're not, again, constrained by those things in the world, the love of that. So, moving along to pursuit of happiness. Can someone from this side? Please.
I'll read it.
Okay, that's right.
And being confident of this, I know that I shall remain and continue with you all for your progress and joy of faith, that your rejoicing for me may be more abundant in Jesus Christ for my coming to you again. Only let your conduct be worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or am absent, I may hear of your affairs, that you stand fast in one spirit, with one mind striving together for the faith of the gospel, and not in any way terrified of your adversaries, which is to them a proof of perdition, but to you a salvation, and that from God. For to you it has been granted on behalf of Christ, not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for his sake, having the same conflict which you saw in me and now here is in me.
Thanks. So this is a really interesting picture of the Christian faith as St. Paul is talking to the Philippians and living it out himself. And it's a little bit different than we sometimes think of it, because often we hear when people say, are you a Christian? Or people are talking about that, they think that it comes down to just a belief, or perhaps it comes down to one moment, and then after that one moment, then you're a Christian the rest of your life, and that's that. But we see here from St. Paul a vision of Christian faith that is a process, right? He talks about progress, suffering, striving, which we said earlier that that's part of an authentic life is striving toward God. It's not having a belief and then settling down and being okay with that, but constantly striving, progressing, and struggling toward our salvation. And in the next chapter, in chapter 2, which Abuna may touch on next week, is the well-known verse that Paul says, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. Okay, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. We may be called to suffer for Christ in our lives. But either way, regardless of our circumstance, we have to be constantly striving. We can't be satisfied with our current level of, I don't want to say level, but with our current spiritual life. We should always be attempting to grow in intimacy and closeness with God, our knowledge of God, and our relationship with Him. And to do this, I think that we need to cultivate a desire for that. Because it's easy to say, like, yes, we need to keep growing closer with God, but if we don't feel a desire for that, if we don't have it in our hearts to do that, it's very difficult to continue progressing. And how do you cultivate that desire? How do you get that desire in your heart? There's a quote from St. John Chrysostom, which I'll just read it to you, I guess. It says, for as doing comes of doing, so of not doing comes not doing. Have you given alms? You are more incited to give. Have you refused to give? You have become even more disinclined to give. Have you practiced self-control for one day? You have encouraged self-control for the next day, likewise. Have you indulged to excess? You have increased this inclination to self-indulgence. So, in terms of cultivating and getting the process started toward increasing in our intimacy and our love of Christ, St. John Chrysostom is suggesting to us that doing comes of doing. So if we take even one small step toward that goal, that will make it even easier for us to continue down that road and continue to grow in closeness and intimacy with God. So it's not just a one-time thing, but it's a process. And it begins one step at a time. So even, because sometimes I've had this where I've seen someone who seems so spiritual and so, I just really admire the way that they relate to God and their passion and their closeness. And I think, or I've thought to myself, I could never be like that. Or I could never achieve that level of spirituality, that level of personal dedication to the cause of Christ. But what St. John Chrysostom is saying is one step at a time. Taking one step in that direction will make it even easier. And so I think you understand the point. Because even the saints and the Desert Fathers, if you read the stories of our Desert Fathers in our tradition, which I highly recommend, they have insights in spirituality, and their dedication to Christ is just, it's incredible to read some of the stories and their level of dedication. And still, they weren't satisfied with their lives. They were even striving farther. Because when we become stagnant, we become complacent, and that, again, not doing begets not doing. So if we become stagnant, we don't care, it's even easier to not care and not care. So every decision, one day at a time, that's how we progress toward authentic faith. And Paul uses this analogy for progress. He talks about, in other places, faith being like a race. He talks about himself being like a runner in a race. And when you're running, I don't know if, is anybody here a runner? Like run, compete in races? No? Okay, well, from what I hear, people who run in races say you really have to just tune everything else out, all the distractions. And we talked so much in the groups, many of you talked about distractions. We have to tune out the distractions and focus on the finish line, having just a single-minded goal. And this is really this is the language that Paul uses also. So, in closing, there's Paul. So, in closing, there's a couple questions that we can leave here today that will challenge us to really think about how authentic our faith is and how we can put it into practice. What would our church community look like if every single one of us was a little bit less complacent? If every single day we struggled toward greater closeness with God? If we focused less on being comfortable, entertained, safe in that section of yellow tape, and more on being united with God and focusing on the rest of the life that we know that we have through Christ, through the resurrection. And I think we'll just leave the discussion right there. We'll have some time for questions and more discussion, but those questions, they are a little uncomfortable, I think, to me, and they might be to you also, because they really challenge us to think about what our community could look like, what we could look like as Christians, what our faith could be, and thinking about our shortcomings, or it can be uncomfortable, but that's where growth happens. And I don't want this to be a discussion focused completely on deficits. I mean, the take-home message is that we have a vast freedom and a vast joy, a vast life that we have access to through Christ. And by uniting ourselves with Him, by passionately pursuing that, that's a positive thing. We can do that. This is joy and happiness that we're talking about, immortality. It's not a deficit-based message that we're coming away from today, I hope. But these questions are challenging. And I hope that through that challenge, we can kind of resist complacency and grow as a community and as individuals. So, be eager to hear what thoughts you guys have.